breakaway nation in the harsh climates of Central Africa to most wouldn't seem significant, but this particular country has fought tooth and nail for its hard-earned independence from Sudan, an achievement which touts it as the newest country in the world. There is some contention as to what is Sudan and what is not, but historically the region encompassing the lower half of the Nile is considered Sudan. Before British colonisation, however, an excess of Arabs came to dominate ethnically what is now modern-day Sudan, as historically Arab Muslims penetrated that far with their trade and commerce and rule, with the native African peoples of South Sudan being too far detached as to be completely undisturbed culturally. As a result, two important differences between modern-day Sudan and South Sudan. Sudan is very much similar to Egypt and Arabia and the rest of the Muslim world, and South Sudan is this previously tribal country that was more influenced by the Europeans, with much more of its society following Christianity and speaking English as its primary language and so on. In 2016, this newly born country sought its fortune in the East African community, possibly making it a nation that could be in the East African Federation. This is South Sudan, the most problematic region of the EAF. The centrepiece of this land is the Nile River. It provides the only proper farmland the country has when it bursts its banks, washing valuable nutrients over the soil surrounding it. With its south being on the equator, the country has either a very hot or tropical climate, with mainly sparse vegetation among savannas and plains, and the heaviest rainfall concentrated in its south, diminishing as one goes northwards. Its biggest cities, such as its capital Juba, and other cities like Bor, Malakal and Kodok, are all on the River Nile. The British ruled the region in a division known as British Sudan, where Egyptian and British joint forces first occupied the region in 1899, as a way to settle a dispute over rulership between the two countries. The entire Sudanese region was essentially ruled from Khartoum by British governors, where in this time Sudan saw much modernisation economically and in terms of law. In 1922, Britain gave formal independence to Egypt, releasing it from being a protectorate. However, Egypt did not stake their claim to Sudan, leaving it in British hands. Sudan generally saw autonomy under Britain, having a relatively limited amount of governors for the landmass they had to oversee. It wasn't a particularly important region, not having many real exploitable resources at the time, and not a huge amount of strategic importance or ability to the British Empire. South Sudan specifically was completely ignored until after World War I, only asserting intervention when it came to ending slave trade practices among natives. During this time it was largely shut off to outsiders, being very isolated but having a large Christian missionary base and thus creating a large Christian majority there. Interestingly, as time went on with these policies in place and with more scrutiny and experience with the people of Sudan, it was decided that South Sudan was closer to the East Africans, mainly being Swahili-speaking peoples, and so was designated for unification into British East Africa instead. This is perhaps what led to the establishment of South Sudanese nationalism and the belief that this land should be its own state. Eventually, when Sudan got independence in 1956, the Khartoum-based government, much like the British, gave autonomy to the South Sudanese in respect to their loyalty, however relinquished it quickly in an attempt to reap the economic rewards. This infuriated the South Sudanese, who went on to fight brutal civil wars on and off between 1955 and 1972, and then again between 1983 and 2005, a very horrific and guerrilla-based war. In 2011, the Sudanese government held a referendum, with an overwhelming 98.3% voting yes to independence. This unity was short-lived, however, with civil war quickly erupting and lasting until 2020, due to the president accusing a cabinet member of attempting a coup. This war infamously had a lot of atrocities, including rampant sexual violence and the recruitment of child soldiers. The very recent end of this in February 2020 leaves South Sudan in a state of relative peace, with the formation of a new unity government and the country attempting to get back on its feet. There isn't much to be said about the South Sudanese economy, but the CIA Factbook puts it pretty well. Industry and infrastructure in landlocked Sudan are severely underdeveloped and the poverty is widespread, following several decades of civil war with Sudan. Continued fighting within the new nation is disrupting what remains of the economy. South Sudan has little infrastructure, about 10,000 kilometers of roads, but just 2% of them are paved. Poverty and food insecurity has risen due to displacement of people caused by the conflict. With famine spreading, 66% of the population in South Sudan is living on about less than $2 a day. Inflation peaked at over 800% per year in October 2016, but dropped to 118% in 2017. And maybe the most important of them all, South Sudan is one of the most oil-dependent countries in the world, with 98% of the government's annual operating budget and 80% of its GDP derived from oil. It is no secret that South Sudan's tiny GDP comes almost exclusively from the oil it produces. During the civil war, especially during 2013 and 2014, South Sudanese oil production fell significantly, although it has seen an uptick in recent years. It is likely that the nation's future economy will either come from further oil exploitation or vanish entirely if them reserves disappear. South Sudan, being the youngest nation on Earth, also carries with it one of the youngest peoples. The majority of the population being young men and women could be an opportunity for South Sudan, or it could be a disaster. It has the opportunity to control itself through an inevitable military monopoly, which it needs to contend with its neighbours and internal conflict, keeping many men under the government's watch instead of potentially suffering from disenfranchisement elsewhere and feeling the need to revolt. This said, a young population leads to potential for industrialisation, as it is this segment of society you want to concentrate on such labour. The most crucial geopolitical issue South Sudan must address is the Ibe area. It is a disputed region after its independence from Sudan, and neither side wants to lose it because it has a huge amount of oil. Otherwise, its border is relatively intact and has been since the 1956 alignment, an agreement made upon the independence and negotiations of Sudan starting in 1956. It is imperative for South Sudan to hold on to this region, as it may be the key to having any form of modern industry or economy, and this will likely cause conflict in the future. It means that South Sudan and Sudan must maintain a military presence in the area, likely arising future flashpoints and border conflicts. It borders 6 countries, 2 of which it has border disagreements with. The first being with Sudan, as mentioned, and another with Kenya called the I-Libby Triangle. This one is slightly more of a problem, as these are 2 potential members for the EAF. However, one could argue this may not be a problem if both borders dissolved upon integration. South Sudan's ultimate geopolitical problem is its lack of mineral resources and coastline, and just inevitable isolation from the rest of the world. It can't reach the sea anymore after its secession from Sudan, and it must go through its East African brethren to reach the rest of the world. South Sudan's role in the East African Federation lies exclusively on its population. It is very much Swahili and English dominated, as well as being a very Christian dominated country, both of which align it with the other members. The country first signed up to the East African community as recently as 2016, which is potentially quite fast to seeing this was a mere 5 years after its independence. South Sudan, however, likely would be an enormously problematic region for the EAF to hold. Due to likely future instability, a very weak economy and a poor government, it would likely be a huge burden on the potential union. It also would create a poor border with the rest of the country, making a bizarre shaped salient between Central Africa and Ethiopia, which is strategically a poor decision and would stretch out administration and infrastructural potential, as well as military potential. This said, perhaps for the legitimacy of the Swahili culture, the EAF needs to take on this young nation, and put in the investment and time to integrate it into the East Africa like was prepared for the British 90 years ago. With the correct exploitation of oil reserves, the modernisation of South Sudan's economy, and the improvements in quality of life of its population, South Sudan could be an unseen powerhouse in the making.